So now I'm going to introduce the concept of cell types, mostly the difference between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells, and just a little bit about cell theory. And so, just really quickly, take a look at these two images that compare a eukaryotic cell, which is this guy up here, and the prokaryotic cell, which was this one down here. So, just really quick, I'll talk about it in a little bit. But "you" means true, and "karyote" means kernel, right? So, when you say "you," and karyote, this means like true kernel. And basically, what it's saying is that this one actually has like a true nucleus, right? So think of that kernel like the nucleus, which is the very center of a cell. It's kind of like what protects the DNA. It's like the DNA's house, right? But as you can see down here, this prokaryotic cell does not have that nucleus that protects its DNA. Right. So pro means before, and again, karyote means kernel. So this one came like before there was a nucleus, right? And this one has a true nucleus. So U true nucleus, pro prokaryote means it came before there was a nucleus in the cell, right? So here you just see the DNA kind of hanging out in the open without a shelter to protect it. Right. So it's kind of how you can think of it. And so these guys came first down here. You can see they look a lot less they look a little bit they're not as complex, right, as this guy up here. So that's kind of what we're going to see when we're comparing these prokaryotic cells, which came first, and then these eukaryotic cells, which evolved later. And so here we're talking about levels of organization. And we talked about levels of organization before, but like at an ecosystem level. Now we're talking about this like at the organism level and below, right? So as you're talking about the atom, this is like the least complex. And as you go down right here, down this list, it gets more complex. Right. So an atom is a basic building block of all matter, right? Everything in this universe is matter, except things like energy, which are like electricity, heat, light, those kinds of things. But as you go down the list right here, it starts to get more involved. So molecules are like two or more atoms put together. And then biomolecules are tons of these atoms put together into large chains. Remember, we talked about polymers. And then as you go, remember, cells are pretty much made up of all of these different types of biomolecules right here, lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, right? We talked about this before. And so, again, cells are made up of these biomolecules. But then these tissues, and you can see we're kind of getting over here, we're talking about the organelles. And the organelles are just little things that make up the cells, right? The way we have organs like a heart, a brain, all that, all of those things. Cells have kind of mini organs called organelles, right? And then you see a bunch of organelles make up the cell. And then right here, when you get to the tissue, a bunch of cells put together are what make up the tissue, right? So, like, we're talking about fatty tissue. There are certain cells that make those things, muscle tissue, certain cells make that. And so here you see that the next thing is organs, right? And organs right here are made up of different kinds of tissues. So you can see it's getting more complex as we go down the list right here. And then organ systems right here, you see the digestive system is made up of different kinds of things like the stomach, intestines, liver, that those sorts of organs, right? And then beneath the organ system, or actually as you go down and it gets more complex, organ system, a bunch of different organ systems make up an organism, right? So that's why we have our digestive system, our nervous system, our skeletal system. All of these things right here make up an organism, right? So this is what the levels of organization look like when you're talking about levels that get beneath that organism, right? So you start with the more basic of the as the atom right here, and it gets more complex as you get down to the organism. And so cell theory. The cell theory states, and remember, y'all, theory is something that has been proven time and time again and has not been disproven yet. Right. So the cell theory, the first part of this says that all living things are composed of one or more cells. Right. So again, a cell can be a living thing can be one cell, or it can be many cells working together, right? Like us. We have uh more than one cell, definitely, right? We have cells, and not just human cells, but we also have bacterial cells working within our body, right, to help keep us alive. And so all living things are composed of one or more cell. You can't really say that something is alive if it's not made up of a cell. It's kind of interesting now with artificial intelligence. Maybe that will change in the future, right? But when AI becomes sentient, but for now, we say that all living things are composed of one or more cell. Cells are organisms' basic units of structure and function. So that is, the basic building block of life is a cell. I said the basic building block of all matter is the atom, but when we're talking about life, living things, the cell is the most basic unit of that. Whoops. And then cells come only from pre-existing cells, right? Saying that the only way we get cells is if it comes from a cell that has already been created, or that has already, existed. But that's probably going to change in the future. Actually, I think I remember reading that they are creating cells from scratch now. So, this may not be the case much longer, but as of now, we'll continue to say that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So another thing to remember is that all cells have the following, right? Whether they're prokaryotes or eukaryotes, all cells have like some basic things in common, right? All cell membranes are made of lipids, right? So I mentioned in an earlier video that the cell membrane is kind of like the skin of the cell, right? And whether it's a prokaryote or a eukaryote, the cell membranes are made of lipids, which are those fats. Then we have, and again, it's considered like a skin because it separates the inside of the cell, keeps that protected from whatever is outside of the cell. Right? There's also DNA and RNA, and so that will usually be in the center of the cell. And so we're talking about eukaryotes. Remember, those have a nucleus to house the DNA, whereas the genetic instructions for building proteins, right? That's the DNA. And so eukaryotes will have the nucleus like a shelter for the DNA, but prokaryotes won't. So enzymes and other proteins, those are needed to keep the cells alive and keep them doing what they do. And so enzymes and other proteins are found in the cells. And whenever you see ribosomes, yeah, that's a good indicator that proteins are being made there. Right. So again, these are needed to perform the jobs in cells necessary to grow, reproduce, and maintain homeostasis. So basically to keep it alive, right, and doing whatever function it needs to do. And so the cytoplasm is just this semi-fluid inside of the cell. So water-based plasma that the molecules in a cell diffuse through. So it's kind of like the way they travel around through inside the cell is through this water-based plasma. And it'll be called cytoplasm, cytosol. Sometimes you'll see that. Not exactly the same thing, but similar. And so these are the main components. And here you see the ribosomes again that are where those proteins are being created. But all cells, whether prokaryotes or eukaryotes, will have some of these similarities, right? And so, again, the ribosome are the sites of these proteins where they're created. Another word for synthesis, not technically an organelle because they're not membrane bound, right? So, kind of just like float around in there. And so, these are the things, again, that all cells have in common. But now we're breaking it down into the eukaryotic versus prokaryotic. So there are two types of organisms based on their cell types, right? The prokaryotes are those bacteria. So they're simpler, they evolved a lot earlier. They're again not as complex and they have less components than a eukaryote. And the word pro means before and karyote means kernel, but we can think of that as a nucleus, right? So prokaryote, those came before there was a nucleus. U is true, it means true. And karyote, again, think of it as nucleus. So these have a true nucleus, right? And these are the animals, plants, fungi, and protists. And so here you see at the bottom, remember that pro came before the nucleus. So prokaryotes before, and U means true. And these actually have that true nucleus, right? And here you see that you can always tell, like even if you're looking at a microscope, the cells that are eukaryotes, they have this chromosome. Sorry, they have this nucleus that houses like the DNA material. So you always see that darker nucleus in those cells. And so again, eukaryote right here, you can see the nucleus, and over here, and you can see the little organelles in that. And then this one right here is the prokaryote. So prokaryotic organisms are unicellular organisms, right? All bacteria are unicellular prokaryotes. So think of the prokaryotes as like the smaller, less complex bacteria. There are single and multicellular eukaryotic organisms. So protists are mostly unicellular eukaryotes, but again, they will have that nucleus that houses their DNA, and they have different other organelles that separate them from the prokaryotes. Fungi are mostly multicellular eukaryotes. So fungi is like mold and mushrooms and things like that, and those guys are eukaryotes. They have nucleus that houses their DNA. And then plants and animals like us, we are all multicellular eukaryotes and definitely, have those organelles, which we'll talk about, like mitochondria. We don't have chloroplast, but plants do, and the nucleus that houses our DNA. And so prokaryotic cells, again, they lack that nucleus and other organelles. The DNA is naked in the cytoplasm. So again, their DNA does not have shelter within a nucleus. Whereas eukaryotic cells, those are cells that do contain a nucleus, right? So they do have a home for their DNA, like what we do, right? And it's very important, y'all, because once your DNA is no longer, like if it starts getting messed up, then it can lead to certain diseases. And other membrane bound organelles like mitochondria and chloroplasts in plants and things like that, which will Golgi bodies, all of these things we'll see in later lessons. So remember, the nucleus is a membrane closed cell component. Again, it's kind of like the little shelter for our DNA, which again, DNA is very important because those are our genetic instructions for building proteins, which is basically like building a living thing. All right, so some very important instructions there in the DNA. Organelle, just a membrane enclosed cell component that performs a specific function. So again, like we have organs, right? We have a heart, we have lungs, skin, all of that. Our cells also have little organs like that that perform certain functions that keep the cells and then keep us alive. So prokaryotic cells are much smaller than eukaryotic cells, right? So here you see this prokaryote a lot smaller compared to this larger eukaryotic cell in the background, right? You see in here the DNA is kind of floating inside of the prokaryotic cell, but in this eukaryotic, it's housed within this purple nucleus right here, right? Eukaryotic cells have more internal uh, membranes and are more organized and efficient at performing tasks. And so here you see all the little organelles in here and there, and the nucleus. And so, it's more complex. It has a lot more parts performing the thing. It's more efficient, y'all. What our cells do. Cells again started off doing a little bit of everything, but as cells evolved, they started evolving all these organelles that allowed it to function a lot more smoothly. Right? You can think of a large business. If one person is doing every job, then that business is probably not going to run very efficiently, right? But as the business starts to specialize in like certain departments and certain roles and things like that, then the cell can function a lot more efficiently when it specializes in certain things, right? Like mitochondria creates energy. If you're talking about plants, chloroplast helps with photosynthesis. And so it makes the cell perform a lot better when it can have organelles that specialize in certain roles, right? So not one employee is doing everything, but you have a bunch of different employees specializing in different areas, right? So that's why our cells, have all the organelles that they do now. They've evolved. And so, just really quickly, there are some differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Not going to go over all of these, but definitely know the nucleus, right? That's important to know that prokaryotes do not have one, eukaryotes do. Prokaryotes do not have organelles, eukaryotes do. The cytoplasm, remember, both of these have it. Cell membrane, they both have that. Cell walls, I'm not going to get into too much detail, but when we do get into plants, we'll talk more about cell walls. Ribosomes, remember, both of them have them. DNA, both of them have it, but remember, the prokaryotes are just floating around there freely, whereas ours and eukaryotes, they're wrapped up in a nucleus. And so prokaryotes include the bacteria, and eukaryotes include all these other categories of plants, animals, fungi, and protists. Right in here, you just kind of see that in a picture form, everything that we're talking about, most things right here. You see again, the DNA is just floating freely in the prokaryotic, whereas in us right here, we have the nucleus that protects our DNA. Right, we have all these other organelles here, like the mitochondria, the Golgi body, the where is it right here? Yeah, the ER, endoplasmic reticulum. And so, these are just some of the differences. Remember, similarities. Both have cytoplasm, both have ribosomes, and both have DNA. Just, one is housed and one isn't. So this is kind of like this picture sums it up really nicely. The differences between a prokaryotic cell, which remember, prokaryote before the nucleus, and then eukaryotic cell, it has a true nucleus, right? True, pro, before.